You'd think working nights at a hospital would harden you to creepy stuff. I mean, I've seen it all. Patients talking to people who aren't there, lights flickering for no reason. Even a guy who swore the Grim Reaper was hanging out in the corner of his room. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened in that on-call room. It started with me waking up, or at least I thought I woke up. My eyes snapped open, and I was staring at the cracked ceiling tile above the bed. Something felt off. My arms wouldn't move. My legs wouldn't move. Hell, even blinking felt like running a marathon. I figured, okay, sleep paralysis. Annoying, but not the end of the world. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room where the shadows clumped together like bad gossip, something was standing there. It wasn't a person. I could tell that much. It was darker than the darkness around it, like it had sucked all the light out of that corner and hoarded it for itself. And it wasn't just standing still. It was swaying, like it was trying to decide whether to step closer or let me sweat it out a little longer. Then it spoke, "Follow the code, or they'll follow you." Now, I'm not saying I'm brave, but in that moment, I would have happily traded my soul for the ability to move a single finger, just one. But no, I was stuck there, heart hammering away, wondering if I was going to die from terror or sheer embarrassment at being caught drooling in my sleep. I tried to focus on something, anything, other than the thing in the corner. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It was 3:33 a.m. Of course it was, because when weird stuff happens, it's always at 3:33 a.m. I watched the clock like it held the answers to the universe, but the second hand wasn't moving. It was just stuck there, mocking me with its fake sense of time. And then the thing in the corner moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just was. One moment, it was across the room. The next, it was right in front of me, bending low like it wanted to whisper sweet nothings into my ear. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel it. That's the worst part. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me like a boulder strapped to my chest. Just as I thought I was going to lose my mind, or worse, it lunged. I felt this rush of air, like the room itself had gasped, and then I woke up. I shot up from the bed, sweating like I'd just run a marathon. The clock on the wall? 3:34 a.m. It had only been a minute, but it felt like hours. I sat there, trying to catch my breath, telling myself it was just a bad dream, just my brain playing tricks on me. But here's the thing. The door to the on-call room, it was wide open. And I know for a fact I locked it. After that night in the on-call room, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe the leftover coffee in the break room was spiked. Who knows? But as the week dragged on, it became clear that weirdness wasn't just visiting. It had moved in and was paying rent. Let me back up a bit. Graveyard shifts are already a special kind of hell. If you've never worked one, imagine being trapped in a building full of flickering fluorescents, empty hallways, and machines that beep randomly just to remind you they're alive. Now sprinkle in the fact that this hospital was built sometime before indoor plumbing was a thing, and you've got my life. I work at Fairmont General, a small historic facility, which is polite speak for old and broke. The floors creak like they're protesting every step, the heaters sound like they're coughing up ghosts, and the Wi-Fi doesn't reach half the building. But hey, the vending machines work sometimes. On this particular night, around the third cup of coffee, Nurse Sanders, the kind of woman who could silence a room with one raised eyebrow, decided it was time to drop some wisdom on me. She leaned in like she was about to share classified government secrets. "Bethany," she said, her voice low, "there are a few things you need to know if you're going to survive the night shifts here." I laughed, thinking she was about to tell me where the good snacks were hidden. "Nope. Rule 1. She started, dead serious. Never sleep in room 12 after midnight. "Why?" I asked, still thinking this was some kind of initiation prank. "Doesn't matter why," she snapped. "Just don't." "Okay." Rule 2. Always, always, close the on-call room door fully, no matter what you hear outside. Even if it's you calling for help, I teased, trying to lighten the mood. Her eyes didn't so much as twitch, especially if it's me. Now, I'm not saying I believed her, but the way she said it gave me a twinge of unease. The kind of unease you bury under a laugh and a mental note to tell your friends about later. Rule 3, she continued. If you feel like someone's watching you, don't look around. Just leave. Trust me on this one. Got it, I said, nodding along. So basically, don't sleep, don't listen, and don't look. Sounds like a dream job. She didn't laugh. That night, I kept thinking about what she'd said. The rules, the seriousness in her voice. It was like she believed it, like this wasn't just a joke to scare the new girl. But I told myself it was just late-night paranoia. Then, around 2 a.m., things got... It started small, the flickering hallway light. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but this was different. It didn't flicker like a bulb going back. It flickered like something was walking past it, blocking the light in rhythmic, deliberate steps. Only, when I peeked down the hall, it was empty. Fine. Could have been a power surge. Happens all the time in old buildings, right? I shook it off and went to check on my patient. Room 204 was first. A sweet old man recovering from surgery. As I entered, he was staring at the corner of his room, his face pale. Mr. Reeves? Are you okay? I asked, flipping on the... His head jerked toward me so fast I jumped. You didn't see it? He whispered, his voice shaking. See, he pointed to the now empty corner. There was something standing. I smiled, trying to reassure him. It's probably just your imagination. Hospitals can feel strange. He didn't look convinced. It wasn't my imagination, he muttered, pulling the blanket up to his... By the time I made it back to the nurse's station, I was starting to feel the unease creep in. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from down the hall, near room 12. Don't be stupid, I told myself. It's probably just the pipes. But as I walked closer, the sound grew sharper, more deliberate, like knuckles on wood. Tap, tap, tap. When I reached the door to room 12, I hesitated. There was no reason to open it. No patients were assigned there. But the sound was definitely coming from inside. I leaned in just for a second, and the tapping stopped. Dead silence. And then, as I turned to walk away, I heard something that froze me in place. A soft voice, low and strained, whispering from the other side of the door. Bethany. I didn't open the door. Let me just say this. When people tell you not to do something, it's human nature to want to do it even more. Like, don't touch that hot stove? Boom, blistered fingers. Don't eat that week-old takeout? Hello, food poisoning. So, when Nurse Sanders gave me her little list of spooky hospital commandments, what do you think I did? That's right. I went to the on-call room during my break and plopped down on the same lumpy cot where I'd had that dream. In my defense, I was dead tired. The kind of tired where even your bones feel like they're groaning. And, sure, there was a voice in the back of my mind saying, Bethany, this is a bad idea. But it was quickly drowned out by another voice saying, Bethany, you'll fall asleep standing up if you don't lie down. So I did. At first, it was great. The pillow smelled vaguely of bleach, which was oddly comforting, and the hum of the old HVAC system was just loud enough to drown out my thoughts. I was out in seconds. But then, like before, I woke up, or thought I did. It hit me immediately. The weight. My arms felt like lead pipes, my legs like they'd been bolted to the bed. My chest tightened, and no matter how hard I tried, my lungs just wouldn't take a full breath. I tried to tell myself it was sleep paralysis again, just some harmless brain glitch, but then the temperature dropped. It wasn't subtle either. One moment the room was stuffy and warm, the next it was like stepping into a freezer. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, little puffs of air, like I was a chimney. And that's when I saw it again. The shadow. It was standing, or hovering really, just inside the doorway. The light from the hallway should have illuminated it, but somehow it seemed to absorb the glow. It shifted slightly, leaning in as though trying to get a better look at me. This time, it spoke. You've broken the code, it rasped, the voice grating, like metal scraping against metal. You'll see them now. Them? I wanted to scream, but my throat betrayed me. My body remained frozen, locked in this cruel standoff with whatever this thing was. As if to punctuate its threat, the shadow figure stepped closer. With each move, the room grew colder. The light bulb above me flickered violently before buzzing out completely, plunging the room into near total darkness. When I actually woke up, I was soaked in sweat despite the icy air. The door to the on-call room was wide open, even though I knew I'd shut it before lying down. The clock read 3:33 a.m. Of course it did. I sat there for a while, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe the shadow was a trick of my overworked brain, and the cold was just the AC on overdrive. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few nights, things escalated. It started with whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the usual hum of hospital machinery. I'd be walking down the hallway, and just as I passed a darkened room, I'd hear it. Words too quiet to make out but sharp enough to send a shiver down my neck. Then came the reflection. It was during a routine vitals check when I noticed it. The patient had one of those old metal bedpans sitting on the nightstand, polished to a mirror-like shape. As I leaned over to check her pulse, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, a dark shape standing behind. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the IV pole, but there was nothing there. By the end of the week, I started to see it everywhere. The reflection of the automatic doors as they slid open, there it was. The surface of the break room microwave? Even the glossy floor tiles seemed to ripple with its distorted shape when I wasn't looking directly at it. The worst part, though, was the patience. It began with Mr. Reeves, the sweet old man who'd seen something in his room that night. He passed away suddenly during my shift. No warning, no signs of deterioration. One minute he was fine. The next he was gone. Then it was Mrs. Harper, a patient on the other side of the ward, and after her, a young man recovering from a car accident. Every single time I was the one on duty, and every single time the shadow figure's voice echoed in my mind. You'll see them now. It wasn't until I heard their names, whispered in that awful, grating voice during my paralysis episodes, that I connected the dots. Desperate for answers, I started poking around the nurse's station during the quieter hours of the night. It was there, hidden behind a stack of ancient training manuals, that I found the logbook. The cover was brittle, the leather cracked and faded, but inside were pages upon pages of scrawled notes. Dates, names, and cryptic entries like, took a nap in room 12. 3 days later, gone. Or, heard knocking outside the on-call room. Shouldn't have opened the door. The most chilling entry read, Bethany, if you're reading this, it's already too late. I closed the book and sat there, my mind spinning. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. The rules weren't just hospital folklore, they were survival tactics. And I had broken them all. You'd think by now I'd have learned my lesson, that I'd just call in sick, maybe check into a psych ward, or at least quit and become a barista. But no. Instead, I decided to lean into the madness. It wasn't bravery, really. It was more like spite. If this thing was going to ruin my life, I wanted to ruin its night. So there I was, dragging myself into the on-call room at the start of another graveyard shift. In one hand, I held the dusty logbook I'd found. In the other, a handful of charms that my colleague Maria insisted would keep the bad spirits at bay. Maria was one of those people who always had a little pouch of salt in her pocket and whispered prayers over her coffee. I wasn't sure I believed in her methods, but at this point, what did I have to lose? The night started quietly, which, as anyone in healthcare will tell you, is never a good sign. Around midnight, I decided to stop stalling and headed to the on-call room. I shut the door firmly. Sanders' rule number 2, after all, and set up my little survival kit. The logbook sat open on the desk, pages filled with scrawled warnings that I was still trying to piece together. Maria's charms, a rosary, a small vial of holy water, and something she called witch's salt, were lined up in front of me like weapons in an arsenal. The room felt tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. At exactly 1:45 a.m., the lights started flickering. It wasn't the soft, gentle flicker of an old bulb. This was violent, like the fixtures were trying to rip themselves out of the ceiling. I stayed seated, gripping the edge of the desk and pretending I wasn't completely regretting my decision. Then came the first slam. The door to the on-call room flew open so hard it hit the wall with a crack. I jumped, nearly knocking over the holy water. The hallway beyond was empty, of course, but I swore I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing louder. I closed the door, wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt heavier, thicker. By 2:30, things had escalated. It started with the hands. The first one appeared on the edge of the desk. A pale, veiny thing with long, crooked fingers. It wasn't attached to a body. It just crawled up like some grotesque spider. I froze, too terrified to move, as more of them appeared. One gripped the back of my chair. Another clawed at the door. Then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "You don't belong here," the voice growled, distorted and layered, like it was coming from multiple mouths at once. By 3:00, I was seeing faces. They hovered in the shadows, distorted and wrong. Eyes too large, mouths stretched unnaturally wide, their features constantly shifting like they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. One face leaned out from the corner of the room, inches from mine, and whispered, "You're one of us now." I screamed. Not a little yelp. A full-blown primal scream. The faces vanished, but the clock on the wall began ticking louder and louder until it stopped abruptly at 3:33 a.m. And then it appeared. The entity was no longer content with lurking in the shadows. It stepped, or more accurately, into the room. A shifting mass of darkness, hands and faces that twisted and coiled like living. Its presence was suffocating, filling every inch of the small space until I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, clutching the rosary so tightly it dug into my palm. It laughed again, a sound that made my stomach churn. "You broke the code," it said, its many voices overlapping. "Now you see, now you—" The faces on its surface sneered and wept, their hollow eyes staring through me. I recognized some of them. Patients who had died, staff who had disappeared. One of them was Mr. Reed. "You're lying," I spat, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "Am I?" it hissed. "You've stayed, you've listened, you've looked, and now you are one of us." The room began to distort. The walls pulsed like a living thing, and the floor beneath me felt like it was shifting, pulling me down. I threw the holy water at the entity, and for a brief moment it recoiled, its form writhing and shrinking. But it didn't retreat. "You think that will save you?" it growled, surging forward. The chair I'd wedged under the door flew across the room, slamming into the opposite wall. I stumbled back, clutching Maria's charms like they were my last lifeline. "Why me?" I yelled. "What do you want?" The entity's faces split into a grotesque smile. "I want you to remember, to carry us with you, forever." The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for the door, tripping over the chair as the entity closed in. Its voices were deafening now, a cacophony of screams and whispers that drowned out my thoughts. Somehow, I made it into the hallway, but the hospital wasn't the same. The walls stretched endlessly, lined with doors that opened and closed on their own. Shadows darted across my path, and the whispers followed me no matter how fast I moved. By the time I stumbled into the nurse's station, the logbook was gone, and the clock still read 3:33 a.m. I didn't know if I'd escaped or if the nightmare had just begun. I wish I could tell you I had some master plan, that I went into that room armed with knowledge and a foolproof way to banish the thing that had been tormenting me. But no. By the time I faced it, all I had was desperation, a handful of half-baked ideas, and the kind of reckless courage that comes from knowing you've got nothing left to lose. I stood in the center of the on-call room, holding the logbook in one hand and a lighter in the other. The lighter was Maria's. She had handed it to me earlier that night, with a knowing look and a quiet, "just in case." At the time, I thought she was being overly dramatic. Now, I wasn't so sure. The air was thick and heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The clock on the wall was stuck at 3:33 a.m., its hands motionless. I could feel it watching me even before it appeared. "All right," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's get this over with." It didn't waste time with theatrics this time. The shadows in the room coalesced, gathering in the corner like a storm cloud before spilling outward. The entity took shape, its mass shifting and writhing, faces and hands emerging and disappearing like they were trapped in some terrible "You should have left," it said, its voice low and layered, as if it was speaking through dozens of mouths at once. I swallowed hard and opened the logbook to the page I'd. The handwriting was barely legible, the words smudged with time, but the passage was clear enough. A string of strange, almost lyrical phrases that Maria had insisted would banish the "Here goes nothing," I whispered, and began to read. The first line felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. I half expected the entity to laugh at me, or worse, roll its eyes and vanish out of sheer second-hand embarrassment. But as I stumbled through the second line, the room began to change. The walls trembled, the fluorescent light above me flickered violently, and a low hum filled the air. For a moment, I thought it was working. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and breaking apart like static on a screen. But then it laughed. Not the low, guttural chuckle I'd heard before, but a loud, mocking laugh that filled the entire room. The shadows surged forward, slamming into me with a force that knocked the logbook from my hands. "Do you think words can stop me?" it sneered. The faces on its surface twisted in grotesque smiles, their hollow eyes gleaming. "Your fear feeds me. Your resistance strengthens me. You are mine." The next thing I knew, I wasn't in the on-call room anymore. The walls had vanished, replaced by a swirling void of darkness. Around me, scenes began to take shape, ghostly, translucent figures playing out their final moments. There was Mr. Reeves, his face pale and lifeless as he gasped for air in his hospital bed. There was Nurse Sanders, standing in this very room, clutching her chest as she collapsed. And there were others, dozens of them, staff and patients alike, all frozen in their last agonizing moments. "You see now," the entity said, its voice echoing around me. "You cannot escape." The vision shifted, and I saw myself, sitting alone in the on-call room, my face pale and gaunt, my eyes sunken and empty. It was like looking into a mirror that showed the future, and the sight made my stomach turn. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not going to end up like them." The entity's laughter grew louder. "You already have," it said. I don't know what came over me in that moment, whether it was courage or desperation or just blind rage, but I grabbed the lighter from my pocket and flicked it on. The small flame flickered weakly in the oppressive darkness, but it was enough to give me an idea. "You like this room so much," I said, my voice trembling. "Let's see how you handle it burning." I moved quickly, grabbing the nearest flammable object, a stack of old medical records, and holding the lighter to it. The paper caught fire instantly, the flame spreading hungrily across the desk. The entity shrieked, its form twisting and convulsing as the fire grew. The shadows recoiled, and for the first time, I saw something like fear in its many faces. "This room is your anchor, isn't it?" I shouted, feeding more paper into the flames. "You're tied to this place. Well, let's see how you like being untied." The fire spread rapidly, the heat searing my skin as smoke filled the room. The entity lashed out, its shadows whipping toward me like living tendrils, but I dodged them, throwing the logbook into the flames for good measure. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, its voice growing weaker. "Watch me," I shot back, choking on the smoke. The fire roared, consuming everything in its path. The entity let out one final, piercing scream before its form dissolved into the flames, its voices fading into nothing. I stumbled toward the door, coughing and gasping for air as the room burned behind me. The last thing I saw before I escaped was the clock on the wall, its hands finally moving again. By the time the fire department arrived, the on-call room was nothing but ash. They asked me how it started, and I gave them the best answer I could. Faulty wiring, maybe. No one questioned it, but I knew the truth. And as I stood outside the hospital, watching the flames die down, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd really destroyed the entity, or if I'd just set it free. People like to think a fire is the end of things. Burn it all down, sweep away the ashes, and Voila. Clean slate. I used to think that too. But standing in the smoldering remains of the on-call room, my arms bandaged, my lungs still burning from the smoke, I realized fire doesn't erase things. It just leaves scars. The hospital administration wasted no time slapping a narrative together. Faulty wiring, they said. Probably my negligence, they insinuated, though they didn't have the guts to say it outright. Instead, I got a medical leave that was really just a one-way ticket out of there. You've been under a lot of stress, the chief nurse told me, her voice dripping with forced sympathy. Maybe a change of scenery will do you good. I wanted to laugh, but it hurt too much. Yeah, a change of scenery, because new walls and fresh paint would totally erase the memories etched into my brain. My last few days at the hospital were tense. The kind of tense where everyone avoids eye contact and whispers behind your back. I couldn't blame them. I mean, who wants to talk to the nurse who torched an entire room? But there were moments, little ones, that made me wonder if some of them knew. Like Maria, who handed me a box of chocolates with a note that simply said, "You did what you had to do." Or Dr. Patel, who gave me an uncharacteristically firm handshake and muttered, "Be careful out there," before walking away like he'd said too much. Then there was the shadow. It started small, just a flicker in the corner of my eye when I passed reflective surfaces. A shape that disappeared the second I turned to look. But on my last night, as I was packing up my locker, I caught it full on. The mirror on the wall wasn't dirty, but it felt wrong somehow, like it was showing more than it should. And there it was, the shadowy figure, standing just behind me. Its features were sharper now, more defined. But its eyes, or what should have been its eyes, were hollow. "The code is never broken," it whispered, its voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. "It only begins again." I didn't turn around. I didn't even breathe. I just grabbed my stuff and walked out, my footsteps echoing down the empty hall. Leaving the hospital should have felt like freedom, but as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, I blamed the exhaustion. My hands were trembling on the wheel, and the streetlights seemed unnaturally dim. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was there. Not in the back seat, thank God, because I think that would have been the end of me right there. But outside, just a few paces behind my car, keeping perfect stride. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress, trauma, sleep deprivation, all excellent excuses. But as I drove through the empty streets, the figure never wavered. Always there. Always just out of reach. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot. I locked every door and window, double-checked them, then triple-checked them for good measure. Still, I didn't feel safe. Because I knew. The last thing I did that night was dig out the logbook. I'd taken it from the on-call room before the fire. Not because I thought it would help, but because I couldn't leave it behind. Flipping through the pages, I noticed something I hadn't before. The final entry wasn't about a patient or a nurse. It was about me. The handwriting was faint but unmistakable. Bethany, breaker of the code, keeper of the cycle. I don't know how long I stared at those words. Long enough for the house to grow silent, for the air to turn cold. Some rules aren't meant to be broken. Some rules are meant to break you. And as I lay awake that night, listening to the faint sound of footsteps just outside my bedroom door, I realized one thing. The Watcher wasn't done with me yet.